Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you are joining us today. So I want you to picture the ancient city of Corinth for a moment. If you want a modern equivalent, think of a bizarre hybrid between Wall Street and Los Angeles.
Oh, that is a fantastic comparison. It really captures the vibe.
Right. I mean, it was this massive, bustling Roman colony that was just obsessed with upward mobility, visible success, and public image. If you were anybody in Corinth, you projected absolute polished strength.
Yes, you hired tutors to perfect your public speaking, and you dressed in a way that communicated your status to everyone around you.
Exactly. Wait, I should say precisely. You made sure the public only saw your victories. And into that fiercely competitive, image-obsessed culture walks the Apostle Paul.
And he does not look like a conqueror at all.
No, not even a little bit. He has been beaten with rods. He's been stoned and left for dead. He is physically scarred, likely dealing with chronic illness. And, his public speaking is considered highly unimpressive by the local cultural elites.
Which is a huge deal in that society. They valued rhetoric above almost everything else.
So the Corinthians look at this battered, fragile man, and they ask a very logical question. How could someone this broken possibly be the official messenger of a victorious, sovereign God?
It is a fair question from a worldly standpoint, honestly.
It really is. So today, our mission is to do a deep dive into two massive theological treatises on 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 10. We're looking specifically at the absolute paradox of divine strength manifested through human weakness.
It is such a vital text for understanding the Christian life.
It is. And I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now. If you are exhausted by the modern demand to curate a perfect life on social media, or if you feel like your own physical or emotional fragility disqualifies you from being useful to God, well, the sources we are looking at today offer a completely countercultural perspective.
They flip the entire worldly metric of success completely upside down.
They really do. Okay, let's unpack this. Why does a glorious message require such a frail messenger?
Well, that historical backdrop you gave is absolutely critical. We cannot grasp the weight of Paul's words without realizing he is mounting a vigorous defense of his new covenant ministry against critics within the Corinthian church itself.
Right, because these critics had fully absorbed those Greco-Roman worldly metrics, hadn't
Yes, they absolutely had. They wanted a leader who looked invincible. They wanted a philosopher who could dazzle a crowd with rhetorical polish and visible, undeniable earthly success.
And Paul was none of those things.
No. They pointed to Paul's physical afflictions, his constant exhaustion, and his ongoing persecution. And they argued that a man so frequently battered by life could not possibly be carrying the truth of the universe.
So Paul writes this section of his letter to completely dismantle that fleshly standard of measurement.
He establishes a theological framework where his physical weakness is not a bug in the system, nor is it an embarrassment to the gospel. Rather, his frailty is the ordained theater for God's might to be displayed in a way that leaves no room for human boasting.
Okay, let's look at the very first image Paul uses to establish this framework in verse 7. He sets up a massive contrast between a specific treasure and the container holding that treasure.
The treatises we are studying define this treasure very clearly. It is the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ.
So it is the gospel, the announcement of the covenant of grace.
Yes, precious in its origin, coming from the throne room of heaven, and majestic in its content.
But then we look at the container holding it. So think of pouring a priceless, centuries-old vintage wine into a cheap, disposable foam cup that you got from a gas station.
That is a brilliant analogy. It captures the shock value of the text.
Yeah, you have something of infinite, staggering value resting inside the most unremarkable disposable item imaginable. I mean, the specific Greek term used for these jars of clay is ostrakonoiskisin.
Right, which were baked clay pots, the absolute lowest end of household items in the ancient Greco-Roman world.
They were not ornamental vases that you put on a pedestal to show off to your guests, were they?
Not at all. They were used for holding household refuse, or they functioned as cheap little oil lamps that you would simply throw away when they inevitably cracked.
So looking at this from a purely logical standpoint, I have to ask a question. If God possesses absolute sovereignty and boundless capability, why not use a golden chalice? Wouldn't a flawless, dazzling vessel make the message look far more credible to a skeptical world?
Well, that is the most natural human assumption to make, isn't it? We assume that a magnificent message requires a magnificent messenger to validate it.
It just makes sense to our human brains.
But the central theological argument of the text pushes back entirely against that logic. The contrast between the infinite value of the gospel and the cheap, disposable nature of the clay pot is entirely intentional.
God deliberately deposits the treasure into fragile, unremarkable human instruments.
Yes, so that the source of all spiritual strength is never misidentified as human. Think about the psychological reality of this. If the minister of the gospel were naturally dazzling, completely self-sufficient, a flawless public speaker, and practically invulnerable to suffering, well, the watching world would inevitably credit human genius.
Right, they would look at a successful ministry and attribute it to the leader's charisma or superior intellect.
Exactly. They would end up praising the golden chalice and completely ignoring the vintage wine inside it. By using baked clay, God guarantees that the surpassing might belongs to him and not to the messenger.
And if we bring this into the broader scope of Reformed theology, this aligns perfectly with the Westminster Confession, specifically chapter 5, which deals with providence.
Yes, God meticulously ordains the fragility and the cracked nature of his instruments to magnify his own decree and providence.
The source material brings up a brilliant Old Testament parallel to illustrate this. The story of Gideon's 300 men.
Oh, that is such a powerful, such a striking example. When they surrounded the Midianite camp, those men carried torches hidden inside common earthen pitchers.
And in order for the light to shine out into the darkness and terrify the enemy, those clay pitchers had to be violently shattered, right?
Yes, proving the victory belonged entirely to God's intervention.
That imagery of the shattered pitchers is incredibly vivid. And I think asking how those pitchers get shattered leads us right into the next section of the text, where Paul details what that shattering actually looks like in his daily physical life.
Verses 8 and 9 are where we encounter what the sources call the syntax of affliction.
Right. Paul uses a series of 4 specific pairs to describe his experience. And looking at the treatises, the Greek grammar here is doing a lot of heavy lifting before we even look at the vocabulary.
The author uses present passive and middle participles.
And the significance of the present tense here is that it denotes a continuous, ongoing reality, correct?
Yes, Paul is not looking back at a single, isolated historical event like a rough couple of months he had during a missionary journey. He is describing his perpetual, everyday state of existence.
So, suffering for the Christian, and specifically for the minister of the gospel, is a continuous, present reality.
That grammatical reality is a heavy blow to so many modern assumptions about the Christian life. That continuous present tense directly refutes the pragmatic, seeker-sensitive movements that dominate so much of the current religious landscape.
Because those movements often teach, implicitly or explicitly, that the Christian life should be a steady, upward trajectory toward earthly comfort.
Exactly. They suggest that if you are suffering, it indicates a lack of faith, a secret sin, or a failure of your ministry techniques. But the grammar of 2 Corinthians 4 destroys that assumption. Affliction is the normative state of the clay pot.
Let's look at the first pair Paul presents. Hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. I mean, the Greek term for being hard-pressed is phlebomenoi.
Which paints a picture of being under the literal crushing weight of a heavy burden, or being aggressively pressed by a hostile crowd in a narrow street. You can feel the claustrophobia in the word.
But then we see the divine intervention. The phrase all ou, which translates simply to but not. We are hard-pressed, but not stenotrumenoi.
That second word means restricted to the point of total immobility, or trapped in a corner with absolutely no room to breathe or move.
So the believer is hemmed in by the hostile world, yet miraculously preserved by divine capability.
The sources liken this to the children of Israel at the Red Sea. They had the insurmountable, chaotic waters in front of them and the hostile Egyptian army pressing in rapidly from behind.
They were entirely hemmed in. Looking at it through a worldly lens, they were finished.
But by the decree of God, the waters parted. They were hard-pressed, but they were not crushed.
That Red Sea analogy really captures the sheer panic of being trapped. And what I appreciate about this text is that it doesn't just deal with external physical danger. It moves right into the mental and emotional toll of that pressure with the second pair.
Yes. Paul says he is perplexed, but not in despair.
The sources highlight a really fascinating piece of Greek wordplay happening here. The word for perplexed is apromenoi, which essentially means being at a loss.
It means you are looking at your circumstances and you genuinely do not know which way to turn.
Right. And then, for despair, Paul uses exaperumenoi, which intensifies that root word by adding the prefix x.
Meaning being utterly at a loss or driven to a mental point where there is absolutely no exit whatsoever.
And I have to say, it is incredibly comforting to hear the Apostle Paul, the man who wrote a massive portion of the New Testament, admit to being perplexed.
It really is. He openly admits to having moments of deep intellectual and circumstantial confusion where the logic of his situation makes zero sense to him.
It provides immense pastoral relief to the weary listener who feels guilty for not having all the answers, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And this dynamic raises a significant theological point regarding our affections and our intellect during severe trials. While believers may lose their way intellectually, and while they may be totally bewildered by their circumstances, they never lose their hope.
Because their preservation is not dependent on their own cognitive ability to figure out the puzzle of their suffering.
Precisely. Their preservation is securely grounded in the sovereign decree and providence of God. They are aperumenoi. They are confused, they are crying out in the dark, wondering why a specific, agonizing trial has been ordained for them, but they are prevented from falling into exaperumenoi, which is utter, final, suicidal hopelessness.
And the reason they are kept from that final despair is because they possess the treasure inside the clay. They have the internal witness of the Spirit.
Yes, they know that even when their minds cannot make sense of the pain, their lives are governed by a sovereign God who works all things according to the counsel of his will. The confusion is real, but it is bounded by the covenant.
That bounded confusion is such a helpful concept. So we move from the mental and emotional affliction right back into the intensely physical and relational hostility in the third pair.
Paul writes that he is persecuted, but not forsaken.
And the word for persecuted here is dishkomenoi. I mean, this isn't just someone leaving a mean comment about you.
No, the literal meaning of this word is being hunted or pursued like prey by an enemy. It is a terrifying, exhausting image.
You are running, your lungs are burning, and relentless hostility is constantly on your heels. But the counterbalance to that pursuit is the promise that the believer is not forsaken.
And reading the sources, the Greek word used here carries an unbelievable amount of theological weight.
It really does. The word for forsaken is enkatelepomenoi.
This is the precise, specific word that Jesus Christ cried out from the cross when the sky went dark, and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
We have to view this through the lens of substitutionary atonement.
Because Christ acted as the perfect substitute, because he drank the cup of God's wrath and was truly, historically, and legally forsaken in our place, the believer who is in union with him will never face that divine abandonment.
This ties directly to the Reformed doctrine of the perseverance of the saints, which is outlined so beautifully in chapter 17 of the Westminster Confession.
Yes, the believer may be hunted by the world, pursued by enemies, marginalized by their culture, and rejected by their own family, but they are eternally secure.
Christ absorbed the full terror of divine abandonment so that the clay pot, no matter how severely hunted by the world, would never look up and find the heavens closed to them.
That substitutionary reality completely changes the psychological landscape of suffering. It means your pain is never punitive.
And that sets up the final fourth pair of this syntax of affliction. Struck down, but not destroyed.
The word for struck down is katabalaminoi, and this is a highly visceral, physical term.
Picture an ancient battlefield where a soldier is felled by a heavy blow from a weapon, or imagine an ancient Greek wrestling match where a competitor is violently thrown to the dirt. You're physically laid out flat on the ground. The wind is knocked out of you.
But again, that divine intervention steps in. You are struck down, but not a polymenoi.
You are not ruined, and you are not lost to eternity.
To properly analyze the mechanics of this fourth pair, we have to bring in the law-gospel distinction that the source material heavily relies upon.
Right. The law, with its absolute unyielding demands, works in tandem with the curse of sin and the hostility of the world to strike us down.
And this striking down is an active, necessary process to expose our inherent human frailty. It proves to us beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are just baked clay.
That is a primary function of the law, isn't it? To strip away our arrogance, crush our pride, and reveal our absolute inability to save or sustain ourselves.
Yes, but right when we are lying in the dirt, the gospel speaks. The gospel announces our safety and our secure standing in union with the risen Lord.
We are struck down in our self-reliance, but we are not destroyed, because our lives are hidden with Christ in God.
We also need to see how this text systematically dismantles false teachings like the prosperity gospel and theological liberalism.
Oh, absolutely. If our spiritual preservation depended even slightly on our own claypot strength or our own positive thinking, we would be eternally destroyed at the very first blow.
The prosperity gospel claims that believers, if they have enough faith, should never be struck down. This passage declares the exact opposite. Being struck down is the normal, ordained pattern of the Christian life.
The miracle is not avoiding the blow. The miracle is surviving the blow through supernatural grace.
Right.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The text makes a massive pivot, and the theology gets incredibly dense. Verse 10 takes all of this physical and emotional suffering and gives it a staggering Christological definition.
Yes, Paul doesn't just say, well, life is hard, the world is broken, but God gives me the strength to endure it. He says something much heavier.
He says, we are always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus. I want to pause and look at the vocabulary here. Why does the author use the Greek word nekresis for dying instead of the much more common word thanatos?
The distinction between those two words is the hinge upon which the apostle's entire theology of suffering turns. The common word thanatos typically refers to death as a completed historical event.
It is the final cessation of biological life. You die, and it is over.
However, nekresis refers to a continuous process. It is an active putting to death or a persistent daily state of dying.
So Paul is describing a present, ongoing participation in the cross-work of Christ.
Yes. As Reformed believers, we interpret this through the lens of systematic theology, specifically the doctrine of sanctification found in chapter 13 of the Westminster Confession.
This ongoing, continuous dying is the providential mechanism God uses to mortify our indwelling sin.
It is the furnace designed to melt down and shatter our idols of self-sufficiency. Now, we must be absolutely clear on the boundaries here. We do not carry this death to earn our justification.
Right, thinking our suffering pays for our sins is the deadly error of legalism.
Rather, because we are already justified, and because we are already united to the crucified Savior, our daily lives are naturally conformed to his pattern.
The path to glory for the Master led directly through humiliation and the cross. Therefore, it is pure logic that the path for the servant will be marked by the same daily putting to death of the flesh.
That is undeniable.
And what stands out to me is how grounded this is in the physical world. Paul specifically says we carry this dying in the body.
Yes, this isn't just a mystical mood. It isn't a poetic sentiment you reflect on while sitting comfortably in a climate-controlled library with a cup of coffee.
It happens in the physical flesh. Apostolic ministry, and by extension the normative Christian life, is historical and highly visible. It involves real sweat, actual tears, physical exhaustion, and literal visible scars.
The cost of faithful service is paid in the hard currency of physical endurance. You don't get to detach your high theology from the reality of your own nerve endings. When you are struck down, it actually hurts.
That physical realism is precisely what makes the next clause so vital. If the text stopped at carrying the dying of Jesus, we would be left with a theology of absolute despair.
We would end up with a morbid glorification of suffering for its own sake, much like asceticism. But verse 10 contains a purpose clause.
We encounter the Greek word haina, which translates as that or so that. We carry the dying of Jesus in our physical bodies so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh.
This life, or zou in Greek, is not a vague inner vitality. It is not an improvement in our emotional resilience or a better attitude.
It is the indestructible resurrection might of the Lord of glory pulsing through a dying vessel,
which protects the believer from falling into a dark fascination with their own pain. In Reformed theology, the cross is never, ever isolated from the empty tomb.
God ordains the cracking and the dying of the clay vessel strictly for the purpose of creating a visible opening in the invincible life of his Son to shine through.
Exactly.
So let me ask a very practical question on behalf of the listener. How does the watching world actually see this resurrection life if, outwardly, the believer just looks tired, afflicted, and beaten down?
That is a very fair question.
I mean, if my clay pot is visibly cracking, if I am dealing with a chronic illness or my career has collapsed or I am facing intense public hostility, how does my failure and exhaustion translate to a manifestation of glorious resurrection zood?
Well, that is the core paradox of the entire passage, and the answer lies in the supernatural endurance of the saint. Consider the logic of the unbelieving world. When a person is repeatedly struck down, heavily persecuted, constantly perplexed, and financially or socially ruined, the natural expected outcome is total collapse.
The world expects the believer to quit. They expect you to become bitter, to abandon your faith, or to be crushed into absolute silence.
But when that expected collapse does not happen, when the believer persists in faith, continues in quiet, grateful obedience, and maintains a steady hope despite having every earthly reason to curse God and die, the only logical explanation is supernatural.
That kind of endurance defies human psychological capacity.
It provides undeniable proof that Jesus of Nazareth is alive and actively sustaining his servant from heaven. The weakness of the vessel becomes the required backdrop.
If you were strong enough to handle it yourself, people would praise your stoicism. Because you are too weak to handle it, yet you remain standing, they have to acknowledge the divine strength's holding you up.
Furthermore, this present ongoing preservation points us toward a massive future reality. The text connects our present endurance to the future premillennial return of the King.
The resurrection life currently sustaining our fragile clay jars in a hostile world is just a foretaste of the day when our mortal bodies will swallow up death entirely.
Yes, and these breakable, humiliated pots will be exchanged for glorified, imperishable bodies.
Okay, let's take a slight turn here. We have spent a lot of time on the individual experience of suffering. Let's transition to the corporate gathering of the church. How does this specific theology of the clay pot and the infinite treasure actually function on a Sunday morning when believers gather together?
Looking at the sources, they point us directly toward the means of grace.
Yes, when we gather corporately, we engage with what the Reformed tradition calls the means of grace, which are outlined meticulously in chapter 21 of the Westminster Confession.
We have the preaching of the word, which functions as the audible gospel, but we also have the sacraments, specifically the Lord's Supper, which functions as the visible word.
The sources we are analyzing draw a brilliant analogy here. Just as the infinite saving treasure of the gospel is housed in common, unremarkable clay jars in the person of the minister, the spiritual presence and nourishment of Christ are communicated to his people through the most common, unremarkable earthly elements imaginable: ordinary bread and ordinary wine.
That is a stunning parallel to think about. When you walk into a church, you aren't given a dazzling light show. You aren't handed a golden ticket or walked through a complicated elite ritual.
The minister hands you a small piece of baked bread and a small cup of crushed grapes. It is the ultimate physical manifestation of strength hidden in total weakness.
But the sources are very careful to outline theological boundaries regarding how we understand these physical elements, aren't they?
They are very careful because church history is full of errors regarding the table. The Reformed view fiercely guards against two opposite extremes.
On one side, we completely reject the Roman Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, which claims the elements physically and miraculously change into the literal flesh and blood of Christ.
That overglorifies the physical elements.
On the other side, we reject mere memorialism. Well, we reject simple memorialism, which strips the sacrament of its spiritual reality entirely and claims it is only a cognitive exercise of remembering a past event.
That strips the elements of their ordained function. The Reformed understanding is that the elements remain bread and wine, but the believer truly feeds upon Christ spiritually by faith.
Furthermore, the source material explicitly addresses the primary focus of the Lord's table in relation to modern cultural conversations.
Right, and just to report this neutrally, the text states quite plainly that the primary end of the Lord's table is the vertical reconciliation of sinners to a holy God through the blood of the covenant, rather than functioning as a tool for earthly social justice or racial reconciliation.
The table is the covenantal meal where the weary saint, the cracked, exhausted clay pot, comes to find true spiritual nourishment.
It provides such immense pastoral comfort when you frame it that way. You come to the communion table feeling your frailty. You are keenly aware of the cracks in your clay, the sins of your week, the ways you've been struck down.
And you are nourished by the one whose body was physically broken for you. You are sustained by the broken vessel of Christ.
So we have covered a massive amount of theological ground, moving from Greek syntax to the Westminster Confession. But this has to land in the daily life of the listener. Let's break down the application of this theology into three distinct areas: head, heart, and hands. Starting with the head, which deals with our understanding and our intellect.
Engaging the head requires a firm theological rejection of the pragmatism that saturates our age. You must logically understand and train your mind to believe that being struck down does not equal defeat, provided you are in union with Christ.
This is where the battle of the mind is fought. We are constantly tempted to evaluate our spiritual standing by our earthly comfort.
The natural logic of the human brain says, if things are going well, my health is good and my bank account is full, God is pleased with me. But if I'm afflicted, God is angry with me.
You must reject that false logic entirely. You must govern your mind with the truth that your weakness is not a flaw in God's design. It is the ordained feature designed to display His absolute sufficiency.
Your preservation rests entirely on His grace, not your grit.
Moving to the heart, which deals with our affections, I think this is where all of us get tripped up. Do we love the jar more than the treasure?
That is a piercing diagnostic question for the human soul.
Think about your daily routines, your anxieties, your career ambitions. Are you spending all your time and energy polishing the clay, trying to hide your cracks, and striving to look invincible to the people around you? Are you terrified of letting anyone in your church or your workplace see your frailty?
The idolatry of self-sufficiency runs incredibly deep. We naturally want the glory of the treasure to be attributed to the quality of our clay. We want people to think we are smart, resilient, and impressive.
We must allow the furnace of God's providence to burn away that pride.
When the trials come, when the perplexity sets in and you do not know which way to turn, you must let those fires cultivate a genuine humility. We must train our hearts to rest entirely in the covenant and grace.
Your ultimate comfort is not found in maintaining an unbroken jar. Your comfort is found in knowing that Christ was forsaken on the cross, so that your cracked, fragile jar will never face the wrath of God.
Finally, we apply this to our hands, which represents our action and our daily physical obedience in the world.
This brings us to what Reformed theology calls the third use of the law, as detailed in chapter 19 of the Westminster Confession.
The law no longer condemns the believer, but it acts as a perfect guide for grateful obedience. What does it actually look like to act with hands that carry the dying of Jesus?
It means that when you are heavily persecuted or treated unjustly by an employer or slandered by a peer, your hands do not strike back in fleshly vengeance.
Instead, you reach out in the Spirit. You actively engage with the means of grace. You open the Word. You fold your hands in prayer, and you receive the sacraments.
Your action in the world is defined by a faithful, quiet endurance that relies entirely on the life of Christ pulsing through you rather than your own ability to fight back.
I also want to share a very specific, solemn warning from our sources directed at anyone listening who might not be a believer.
The text uses a Spurgeon-esque plea to illustrate your current state, and it is chilling. If you are outside of Christ, you are still an earthen vessel, but you are a completely hollow one.
You do not hold the infinite treasure of the gospel. You hold only the dust of your own rebellion and self-righteousness.
And the warning is severe. When the rod of iron eventually strikes your jar in final judgment, you will shatter completely because you possess no internal supernatural life to sustain the blow.
The plea is urgent. Repent. Cast aside your pride and receive the priceless treasure of Christ today.
That is the dividing line of eternity. To summarize the core thesis we have unpacked today, God intentionally and sovereignly places the brilliant, infinite treasure of the gospel into the most fragile, unimpressive clay pots.
He does this so that His absolute sufficiency is magnified beyond all doubt, and every ounce of human boasting is permanently eliminated from the equation.
I want to speak directly to you, the weary listener. If you are feeling hard-pressed by your circumstances, totally perplexed by your trials, and struck down by the hostility of the world, find comfort in this text.
Your perplexity and your scars are not signs of divine abandonment. They are the exact, ordained conditions required for your shining.
I love how you phrase that. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as we close out this deep dive. Think about the specific cracks in your own clay jar.
The unique trials you have endured.
Yes, the chronic physical illnesses, the relational heartbreaks, the specific agonizing weaknesses you have begged God to just fix and remove. What if those specific jagged edges are perfectly contoured by a sovereign potter to shine the light of Christ onto someone in your life who is sitting at that precise angle in the darkness?
Your cracks aren't flaws in the design. They are the lenses of His grace.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking.